69, update on verbal behavior research with individuals with autism. We did have a room change, so session 60 is actually being held in President's 3, just to let everyone know. I'm Shauna Bradfield, your facilitator for this session. We also have Valerie in the back of the room, and Susan is outside the door. They can help answer any questions or meet any of your needs during the session. So I have a few announcements before I introduce our speaker. The exhibit hall is open until 1 today. The children's play, which I highly encourage everyone to attend, is at 3 o'clock in room 108 with an overflow room of room 109. Remember, in order to get continuing education credits, you must complete and hand in a verification form at the registration desk prior to departing on your last day of attendance, which would be today. This is where you will put the codes given at the end of each presentation. You can access the PowerPoint and any handouts for this session via the conference website or the Groupio app. We are also asking that upon the completion of each presentation that you give us feedback for that session via the new Groupio app as well. For those of you that are on the webcast, please cut and paste the link into your browser for the quiz codes. That seems to be working for those folks. So it is my pleasure now to introduce our speaker. Anna Petersdottir is an associate professor of psychology at Texas Christian University and a part-time lecturer at Reykjavik University in Iceland. Her research at TCU encompasses both basic and applied interests and focuses primarily on verbal behavior acquisition and the interplay between verbal behavior and derived stimulus relations. Dr. Petersdottir has served as the editor of the Analysis of Verbal Behavior and an associate editor of the Journal of Applied Behavior Analysis, and currently serves as the publication board coordinator of ABAI. She has also served as the president of the Texas Association for Behavior Analysis. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Petersdottir.
Good morning. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, very good. I'm very pleased to be here today and thankful for having been invited to come here and present an update on research on verbal behavior with individuals with autism diagnoses. Before I get started, I would like to know a little bit about who is here in my audience today, at least in my live audience. Do we have BCBAs in here? Okay, we have a few. We have any BCABAs? Teachers? Speech paths? All right. OTs? Anyone else? Okay. Well, I am not here today to talk about my own work, but rather to talk about the work of others. So specifically, the purpose of this presentation is to summarize what's been going on in the verbal behavior literature, the empirical verbal behavior literature, for the last couple of years, focusing on studies that have been conducted with individuals with autism spectrum disorder diagnoses. So my goal here is basically to make you aware of new studies that have come out in the last 2 years and may be relevant to what you do in your practice or in your work. And I know that as professionals working in the field, your time to do literature searches and to read research articles is probably limited. Is that a correct assumption? So basically, I'm here to tell you a little bit about research that has been published recently so that you know what's out there. I'm not going to be presenting enough detail on any one study that you'll be able to necessarily walk away from here and implement the procedures, but at least you are going to know where to find articles that may be useful to you. All right, so in this presentation, I'm going to be using Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior as a framework for talking about instructional targets. So I'm going to be talking about MANs, tacts, interverbals, and so forth. And I'm going to be assuming that everybody is familiar with those terms, but beyond basic familiarity, you do not need to be experts on verbal behavior to follow along. All right, so before I start telling you about those research studies, I want to talk a little bit about some general recent developments in verbal behavior research. What you see here, this graph is from, I hope you can see it okay. You may not be able to see the number specifically, but this is a graph from a paper by Sauter and LeBlanc that came out in 2006, so 11 years ago. And in this paper, they reported on the number of studies that had been published from the beginning of time in which one or more of Skinner's verbal operants were measured or manipulated. All right, and so basically what you see in this graph is the number of studies published each year that fell into that category. Skinner's verbal behavior was published in 1957, and the first relevant study came out in 1963. Throughout the 60s and most of the 70s, there's very little empirical research activity related to verbal behavior. More empirical studies begin to appear in the late 70s and throughout the 1980s, and are then published with at least some regularity up until 2004, which was where they ended. Still, this is not a huge number of studies each year. We're talking about usually 2 to 4 verbal behavior studies that were being published each year, and this was with all populations. This included both basic and applied research. And in 2000, there were 8 studies published, but most other years it's 2, 3, or 4, something like that. So my student, Bailey Devine, and I, we recently collected similar data for the period of 2005 through 2016, and we used similar search methods as Sauter and LeBlanc did, and similar inclusion criteria in order to count studies. And we were pretty amazed to find that in the last decade, there's been an incredible growth in verbal behavior research. So remember, in the last graph you saw, we were looking at 2 to 4 articles per year. The squares on this graph represent the total number of empirical articles published each year. We're starting with 18 in 2005. Going up to about 30 per year and 40 per year in the last 3 years of the review period. The filled circles represent applied research articles, which is a majority of these articles, and the open circles represent basic studies. And so there's been an increase in both. It may seem strange that in the last year that Sauter and LeBlanc included, there were only a few articles published, and then we have 18 in the first year of our review period. So you might ask, did we really use the same methods to look for articles that they did? I think we actually did. There may be some of the increase, maybe a few articles may be attributable to improved database coverage, more journals with relevant research being included in PsycInfo and Web of Science, which we used for this search. But I think it's also, I think this is also a real increase. I think it is also the case that, yeah, there just was a lot of increase in the publication of verbal behavior studies at this time. So for example, in 2005, the first year of our period, the journal, The Analysis of Verbal Behavior, published a lot more empirical research articles than it had ever published before. And also that same year, JABA published several verbal behavior studies, and it had published very few verbal behavior studies before. So this is good news. It means that I'm going to have a lot to talk about here today. Just to talk a little bit more about the studies that we identified, the majority, like you saw, the majority of the studies that we found were applied research articles. This graph shows the populations that were studied in verbal behavior research from 2005 to 16. We see that the majority of applied studies, if you look at the gray bar, big gray bar right there, this is applied studies in which the participants were children under the age of 18 from clinical populations, and a majority of these participants had autism diagnoses. In basic studies, by contrast, those were more likely to be conducted with typically developing children and adults. And in applied studies, the MANT was the most commonly studied verbal operant, followed by the TACT, and then the intraverbal and the echoic. And in basic research, by contrast, the TACT and the intraverbal were most commonly studied. And we're going to see that today. We're going to, before break, I'm mostly going to be talking about the MANT because we have a lot of new studies on manting. And then after break, the studies I'm going to talk about are mostly going to be on TACTs and intraverbals. Okay, so in this review that I am about to present to you, I included all empirical studies on verbal behavior in which at least one participant had a diagnosis of autism. Okay, in most of the studies, all participants had autism diagnoses. There were a few studies that included both participants with and without that diagnosis. In most cases, the other participants were diagnosed with other developmental disabilities. And so I decided to include studies that were published between July 2015 and June of this year, and that's basically because 2 years ago I came to this conference and I gave a similar presentation where I left off in at the end of June of 2015. So I just basically picked up where I left off last time. So how did I find these studies? Well, first I used the database from the study that I just talked about on the verbal behavior articles that have been published since 2005, and I just pulled out the studies that had participants with autism diagnoses. And second, because that database only went through the end of 2016, I also did a PsycInfo search for articles published in the first half of this year. So specifically, I searched for verbal operant terms in the keywords and titles and the abstracts. I also did a search for any additional studies I might have missed that were related to common topics addressed in verbal behavior studies that I'd already located. So, for example, I had found some studies on instructive feedback, and when I did a search for instructive feedback, I found at least one other similar study that was verbal behavior relevant, but verbal operant terms were not used in the title or the abstract. All right, so I included, again, only studies in which at least one participant had an ASD diagnosis. I excluded studies in which the primary focus was on the reduction of problem behavior. So I excluded most studies on functional communication training if they did not specifically focus on the role of the MANT. Not because I don't find these studies interesting, I do. It's just that I would have ended up with way too many studies if I'd included those as well. And for a similar reason, I excluded studies in which the primary focus was on staff training, studies that focused exclusively on listener behavior and not on any verbal operants. And I also excluded studies that focused on textual behavior exclusively. Now, I'm very interested in both textual behavior and listener behavior, so this was hard for me. But I had to kind of narrow it down to a manageable set of studies to present. I excluded studies published in languages other than English because I wasn't able to read them. I do read some languages other than English, but there were no verbal behavior studies published in those languages during that period. Obviously also excluded, this was not a lot of studies, maybe one additional study that I couldn't include because I wasn't able to access the full text. So in spite of excluding a whole bunch of studies and trying to narrow my topic down to as much as I possibly could, I ended up with a total of 70 articles published in the last 2 years. So, yes?
Did you exclude articles that focus on multiple control or joint control?
Did I exclude articles on multiple control and joint control? No, I didn't. I did not find any studies that on multiple or joint control with individuals with autism in this time period, though. So I would not have excluded them, though, because I actually specifically searched for joint control, for example, as well. Okay, so 70 articles, and I wasn't real sure what I was going to do with that. Am I going to summarize 70 articles for you in 3 hours? That gives me, what, under 3 minutes per article, which means I can maybe read you the abstract, and probably not going to be very fun. So what I did was I took the 70 articles, I organized them into 12 themes, and what I'm going to do today is from each one of these categories or themes, I'm going to pick one article that I'm going to highlight and talk about in a little bit of detail. And then I'm just going to tell you about the other studies in that category very briefly so that you still know that they're out there and what was found, but maybe don't get an equal amount of detail on everything. Does that sound okay to you? All right. Okay, so these are the categories of studies. I did count one article twice. If you actually take the numbers in parentheses behind each category, tell you how many articles fell into that category. If you were to actually add these numbers up, you're going to come up with 71. I counted one article in 2 categories because it had 2 experiments that addressed topics related to different categories. But the first category that I'm going to talk about consists of 3 studies that are actually pretty heterogeneous, but in all cases they deal with the topic of establishing echoic control or other functional vocalizations in children who do not communicate vocally, or in one case actually improving the echoic repertoires of children who do speak. These are the 3 studies, and the study I'm going to highlight today is a study by I don't know how to say that, Gewarder and colleagues that appeared last year in JABA. And just for a brief introduction to the topic of this and the next study, in the past a number of studies have evaluated different approaches to promoting the development and promoting vocal development and establishing functional vocalizations of children who do not communicate vocally. So, for example, one approach is to differentially reinforce vocalizations that approximate speech sounds, shape them into closer approximations, and generally gradually establish echoic control. Another approach is to pair adult presented speech sounds with highly preferred items, which has been shown to increase children's production of sounds that resemble those paired sounds. One more approach has been to use lag schedules of reinforcements, which I'll talk about a little bit later in this presentation, to increase the variability of vocalization. So in a lag schedule of reinforcement, you essentially reinforce non-recent responses. So a vocalization would be reinforced, for example, if it's different from the immediately previous vocalization. And finally, it's been found that teaching non-vocal mans, for example, teaching manual signing or PACS, teaching children to mand using other modalities, other communication modalities, has sometimes resulted in an increase in vocalizations. And that is the focus of the study that I'm highlighting today. So again, this is an effect that has been shown in several studies, for example, with PACS, and most recently this effect has been shown with the use of speech-generating devices, which was what this study focused on. How many of you have worked with clients who use speech-generating devices to communicate? Okay, a lot of you have. So are these like tablet-based, iPad-based? iPad, yep. So that's pretty popular these days. So I think this study is possibly relevant to many clients. The participants in this study were 4 boys who had diagnosis of ASD, severe ASD. They did not communicate vocally, and all of them had minimal echoic repertoires, but all had prior experience using SDGs to mand for preferred items. I think in all cases their experience involved iPad-based SDGs. And so the authors wanted to know if they could increase the children's vocalizations that occurred alongside use of the SGD, not DG, sorry. So if they could increase vocalizations that occurred along with the use of the device simply by implementing a differential reinforcement contingency without any additional instruction. Okay, so the application that they used was Go Talk Now, which was presented on an iPad or iPad mini. The screen had one large button in the middle with a photograph of a preferred item. So they selected one highly preferred item for each child based on a preference assessment. The illustration that's on my slide is my own and may not be an accurate depiction of what it actually looked like. For each participant, the target response was to vocalize or approximately vocalize the name of the preferred item. And independent vocalizations were defined as any target vocalizations that were emitted without a prompt from the therapist during a manned trial. And this was regardless of whether the vocalization occurred before or after the speech output from the device. Okay, so those could be echoic responses to the speech output, or they could be vocalizations that occurred before the speech output. A subset of independent vocalizations were defined as vocal initiations, and those were specifically vocalizations that occurred before the speech output from the device. So these vocalizations were potentially mands for the preferred item. We don't know. They could have also just been automatically reinforced vocalizations, but it's possible that vocalizations occurring before the speech output were actually functioning as vocal mands. So in baseline, the participant was presented with the iPad, and each time the child pressed the button that displayed the preferred item, and I'm going to refer to that as the SGD response. And I'm sorry, I just see now, and I thought I checked this 100 times to see that I've reversed the D and the G on a lot of my slides. But in any case, so in baseline, each time that the child pressed the button on the iPad, the child was immediately presented with the item, regardless of whether or not the child also vocalized. If the child vocalized without making a button response or a response on the SGD, the preferred item was not delivered, even if the vocalization approximated the name of the item. And it is important to note that before each session, the investigators checked to make sure that an EO was present, and they conducted a session only if they found that the child tried to approach or reach for the preferred item. In baseline, there were either no vocalizations or very low levels of vocalizations for all participants. Okay, so in phase 1, they implemented a differential reinforcement contingency such that if the participant emitted the full target vocalization, either with or without the SGD response, the preferred item was delivered immediately. If the participant emitted a vocal approximation and also made an SGD response, the preferred item also was delivered immediately. If the participant made only an SGD response and did not vocalize, they also received access to the preferred item, but not until after a 5-second delay. So that was the differential reinforcement contingency. If there's no vocalization, presentation of the reinforcer is delayed compared to when there is a vocalization. And it is important to note that in this phase, there were no prompts to vocalize. So nothing was done to try to get the participants to vocalize. All they did was to implement this differential reinforcement contingency. And in this phase, two of the participants, so there were 4 participants total, 2 participants' independent vocalizations increased to mastery. And vocal initiation, they also began to vocally initiate or say the name of the item before the speech output. They didn't get any full target vocalizations. The increases consisted of approximations, but at least they got dependable increases in these approximations and did start seeing initiations. The other 2 participants' vocalizations, however, did not increase from baseline in this phase. The remaining 2 participants went on to phase 2, and in phase 2, they implemented the same differential reinforcement contingency, except that if the child made an SGD response without vocalizing, they tried to prompt a vocalization echoically. Okay, so they still implemented the 5-second delay. That was followed by an echoic prompt. And if the child now vocalized, the child received the preferred item. If the child did not vocalize, they didn't receive the preferred item anymore. Instead, they just did a distractor trial and then delivered less preferred item. So, so this was basically the difference between the 2 phases. And in this phase, 1 participant's independent vocalizations increased to high levels, and those levels were maintained after the prompts were withdrawn and they returned essentially to phase 1. This participant also began to vocally initiate. The other participant's independent vocalizations remained at low levels, and he didn't start to vocally initiate. However, he did make many prompted vocalizations in phase 2, and his articulation improved. And in fact, this was the only participant who ever emitted full target vocalizations, which he began to do in phase 2, as opposed to just approximations. So basically, to summarize, the vocal initiations, this is not a summary, but additional information. The vocal initiations of the 3 participants who began to initiate occurred in a pretty small minority of the trials, but they did occur reliably. So they also occurred in generalization probes that were conducted without the iPad, which was nice. And like I said, those initiations were potentially MANs. They did not actually verify that these responses were under EO control. So we don't know for sure that they functioned as MANs, but it is possible that these participants were beginning to show some vocal manting simply as a result of the contingencies that were implemented. So in conclusion, in baseline, simply using the speech-generating device was not sufficient to increase vocalizations. Even though in baseline, the speech output was always paired with the delivery of the preferred items, and in some studies, just pairing a particular sound with preferred items has resulted in children starting to produce those sounds or approximations thereof. For the participants in this study, that did not happen. So simply pairing the speech output with the preferred item was not sufficient to increase vocalizations. Interestingly, this is going out on a tangent, but one of my former students, Tracy Lepper, conducted her dissertation on response contingent stimulus pairing, where she was essentially pairing preferred items with speech sounds that were adult produced, but she allowed the participants to control when these pairings occurred. So the participant basically pressed a button and then heard a sound that was paired with a preferred item, which in a way is very similar to pressing the button on the speech-generating device and receiving the preferred item. So all of the participants in that study, if they received the response contingent procedure, they all began to vocalize the paired sound. So I don't know which differences are responsible for these different outcomes compared to the baseline phase in this study. It may be participant characteristics, or it may be other aspects of the procedure that differed. But in any case, so in baseline, there was no increase in vocalizations, but when reinforcement contingencies were placed on vocalizations increased, and for 2 of the participants, no prompts or vocal modeling by the therapist was ever necessary for that to happen. As for other studies in this category, Shibidini, Mota and colleagues compared the effects of 3 instructional procedures on echoic responding for 6 children who had minimal or no echoic repertoires. The 3 procedures were first vocal imitation training, which was basically differential reinforcement of echoic responses. The second procedure they referred to as MAND model, that basically consisted of conducting MAND trials and differentially reinforcing any vocalizations that occurred either following an echoic prompt or before an echoic prompt. And the third procedure was, again, stimulus pairing, where target sounds were paired with the delivery of preferred items with no response requirement by the child. And they found that 5 of the 6 participants began to vocalize either some or all of the target sounds during teaching sessions, and in all cases they showed some evidence of echoic control. And the most effective procedure simply varied across participants, and all 3 procedures were equally often identified as the best procedure. So I think specifically, all 3 procedures were effective for 1 participant. For 1 participant, vocal imitation training was most effective. For 1 participant, the MAND model was most effective. For 1 participant, stimulus pairing was most effective, and so on. And the third study addressed a somewhat different problem, which was poor articulation of echoic responses. So these participants had echoic repertoires, but there was pretty poor point-to-point correspondence between the verbal stimulus and the echoic response. So there were 6 participants in this study, which consisted of 2 experiments. 5 of them were diagnosed with ASD, and the third was diagnosed with ADHD. Their verbal functioning was not clear, but it could be inferred that they had pretty sophisticated listener repertoires. And so the participants underwent an auditory matching to sample protocol. So what that consisted of was they would listen to a sample auditory stimulus, and I'll tell you later what those stimuli were, and then they would listen to 2 auditory comparisons and pick the comparison, or were supposed to pick the comparison that matched the sample. And the intervention involved several phases, and the complexity of the stimulus increased across phases, from single common words like plate, to short phrases, to long and uncommon words. And basically what they found was that the accuracy of echoic responses, whether they were common words, foreign words, long words, uncommon words, improved for all participants. And so they began to echo a variety of stimuli more accurately, simply as a result of learning to listen and match identical auditory stimuli. And they also actually found that the participants increased their accuracy of responding to instructions that were presented with visual distractors increased. So an example of that would be if the therapist said, touch your nose, but modeled touching their head or shoulders or something like that. That would be the visual distractor. And the participants focused more on the vocally delivered instruction and were more likely to be able to respond to the vocal part of the stimulus, or the vocally delivered part of the stimulus, the auditory stimulus, after they had undergone the auditory matching protocol. All right, so the next category of studies I'm going to talk about, actually the next few categories of studies I'm going to talk about all focus on demand. So there were a lot of studies on demand, and I divided these up into several subcategories. The first one I'm going to talk about is studies on selecting command modality for a minimally verbal client. So do we want to teach vocal commands? Do we want to use PACs? Do we want to use a speech generating device, teach manual signing, or what? Again, there are many ways that we can teach a person to command. If we can get vocal commands, that's great, but that may not always be feasible. So some questions that you may want to ask before making that decision for a particular client include: what are they going to learn fastest? What is their preference? What kind of a system do they prefer to use? What is most easily understood by others? And so on. And there were 5 studies that addressed this issue, and the one I'm going to highlight is a study by Ringdahl and colleagues that was published in the Journal of Developmental and Physical Disabilities. So this was a pretty large-scale study that was conducted with 18 children who had most of whom had ASD diagnosis, and along with mild to severe intellectual disabilities. So the other 8 were diagnosed with other disabilities. For 14 of these participants, the demand training that they received occurred in the context of functional communication training as treatment for problem behavior. And so the reinforcer for the demand that was used in the assessment was selected based on a functional analysis of the problem behavior. And 4 additional participants received demand training that was unrelated to problem behavior. So these participants were simply being taught to demand for highly preferred items. So these participants had been referred to the investigators for communication or to their clinic for a communication assessment. All right, so for each participant, the authors identified 2 potential demand topographies, and so 2 topographies that they could perform with similar proficiency. So which topographies specifically were selected just depended on the individual. For example, they could be vocal topographies, they could be manual signs, card touches, micro switch presses, and so on and so forth. And initially, they taught the different response topographies in separate sessions, but using the same reinforcer. So a child might learn 2 topographies to demand for attention, or 2 topographies they could use to demand for a specific item. And once they had mastered both of these demand topographies, they assessed preference by making both of the topographies available simultaneously and reinforcing both of them. So here, these are sample results from one participant. Seth was one of the participants who was referred for communication assessment, so he was demanding for a preferred item in the study. And the 2 topographies that were taught were manual signing, which is represented by squares in this graph, and touching a picture card, which is represented by triangles. So the first phase here shows what happened during training when the picture card is available only in picture card sessions and not in the signing sessions. And signing gets reinforced only in signing sessions, but not in picture card sessions. And we see that during training, the participant is demanding at higher rates in the manual signing sessions than in the picture card sessions, which might lead us to believe that signing might be this participant's preferred modality. However, when both topographies are available simultaneously and both are reinforced, so he can either engage in the manual sign or he can touch the picture card. We see that he switched to pretty much exclusively touching the picture card. So that indicated that he had a preference for the picture card system to communicate. So all of the other participants' results were similar in that they all demonstrated a clear preference for one of the 2 demand modalities. Their specific preferences, as we might expect, varied across participants. For participants who were able to mand vocally, vocal mands were assessed. They were evaluated specifically for 5 participants and identified as preferred in 4 of those cases. Each of the other modalities that were evaluated were preferred by about half of the participants who experienced them. And with the exception that I think they evaluated a speech-generating device with 1 participant, and it was non-preferred. And they evaluated it with 2 participants, and 1 of them preferred it, and 1 of them did not. So I guess that would also be preferred by about half of the participants. So yeah, that was pretty much their conclusion. So basically, this study underscores that different individuals might prefer different ways of communicating, and it might be a good idea to take these individual preferences into account when selecting a communication modality. 3 additional studies compared acquisition or preference for different mand modalities, and all 3 of those specifically compared picture exchange with speech-generating devices. The first study with 3 preschoolers found that it took longer to teach use of the speech-generating device, which was iPad-based, than it took to teach PACS. But preference results were inconclusive. The participants did not have a clear preference for one modality over the other. A second study with 7 school-age children found no differences in acquisition or fidelity of use by teachers. They did find, however, that both participants and teachers were more likely to prefer iPad-based speech-generating device to PACS. And in the final study, the participant was a 4-year-old boy with autism who actually was receiving MAN training in the context of functional communication training. Both were, they looked at 2 different speech-generating devices, one that was iPad-based and one that was a GoTalk device, compared that with picture exchange as well, found that all 3 modalities were acquired with similar ease, and all 3 were equally effective at accomplishing reduction in problem behavior, but both the boy and his parents preferred the iPad option to the other options. The final study was a social validity study that was conducted with undergraduate students. Basically, the undergraduate students watched videos of individuals communicating using 3 different alternative communication systems, and the students rated both the intelligibility and the acceptability of speech-generating devices as higher than picture exchange and manual signing, suggesting that it may be easier for people to understand what's going on when a speech-generating device is used. All right. So, third category contained a variety of different studies that focused on teaching MANs for preferred items. And of course, within the verbal behavior literature, when we initiate communication intervention for individuals who are nonverbal, there's been a recommendation that we start by teaching MANs for preferred items as soon as possible, because the MAND is a verbal operant that benefits the speaker and gives the speaker some control over reinforcers in his or her environment. So again, there were, 6 studies that fell into this category, and I'm going to be highlighting a study by Plavnik and Vitale that came out in the Journal of Positive Behavior Interventions. This was a study on using video modeling during MAND instruction. How many of you have used video modeling as part of instruction? Okay, 1 person. Has anybody, a few. Has anybody used video modeling for MAND training specifically, or for teaching MAND specifically? You usually see video modeling used to teach slightly more complex skills, right? Okay, but in this case, they were looking at incorporating video modeling into MAND instructional trials. They wanted to know if doing so would enhance MAND acquisition. And so the context for the study was that there was a previous study that had successfully demonstrated the use of video modeling during MANT instruction for teaching new MANTs. However, of course, preparing videos to use in this type of instruction is quite labor intensive and time consuming. So in this study, they wanted to know if video modeling actually added enough to the efficiency of the intervention to make that worthwhile. So they compared MANT training that incorporated video modeling to MANT training that did not. So their participants were 4 children with ASD diagnoses who had no vocal communication and limited echoic repertoires, and they targeted vocal MANTs for preferred items and activities. Again, there were 2 conditions. In the in vivo condition, the teacher started a trial by contriving an EO by basically placing a preferred item out of reach or giving the child only a part of an item that was needed to complete a preferred activity. For example, giving the child train tracks but no train. And they then implemented a progressive prompt delay. So initially, after 3 seconds, they delivered a vocal model and then gradually increased that delay to 5 and 10 seconds. And following a prompted response, a participant received 15 seconds of access to the preferred item. And if an independent MANT occurred or an independent vocalization occurred, the child received 30 seconds of access. In the video modeling condition, a trial began by showing the child a video clip that showed another child MANTing for the participant's preferred item, and that MANT being reinforced. They then went on to contrive the establishing operation. They did not at any time prompt MANTs in this condition, so really the only prompt was the video model at the beginning of the trial. And they faded the, if the child did vocalize, I want to say, they did receive 30 seconds. So all vocalizations, of course, were unprompted since there were no prompts. And the child did, just as in the other condition, then received 30 seconds of access to the reinforcer. And then the video model was gradually faded. So once the child had MANTed vocally for the item 3 times, they started delaying the presentation of the model until first 3 seconds into the trial, then 5 seconds, and then 10 seconds into the trial. All right, so they actually analyzed their data several ways, but their primary conclusion was based on the data that are shown in this graph. This graph shows the cumulative number of MANTs that were mastered in each condition, and the closed circles represent the video modeling condition, and the open triangles are the in vivo condition. And we see that although all 4 participants actually mastered MANTs in both conditions, they all mastered more MANTs in the video modeling condition. So these data suggest that video modeling may actually enhance the efficiency of MANT training, even for children who have no vocal communication, which is interesting. I wouldn't have expected that necessarily, to be honest. And but yes, the study does suggest that there may be a beneficial effect here. Some caveats, however, include that there were some differences between conditions in terms of the differential reinforcement procedures and the prompt fading procedures that were used. So it's possible that these differences also contributed to these results. And another caveat is that they didn't actually report how long it took to teach those MANTs. They didn't report training time or the total number of trials that were conducted in each condition. So we don't really know if time-wise the video modeling condition was more efficient as well. For other studies in this category, they were pretty heterogeneous. One study demonstrated a procedure for teaching children to initiate communication with their peers using PECs. Participants were children with ASD who were 3 to 4 years old, and The peers recruited from the study were typically developing children of the same age. They were recruited from the community. All of the participants with autism successfully learned to initiate communication with their peers. And what was cool was also that the peers' spontaneous initiations to the participants with autism also increased. So I thought that was nice. In another study on PECs by McDonald and colleagues, the participant was a 6-year-old boy. And he had mastered phase 4 of PECs, which is creating sentence strips like "I want apple," but he never actually approached the PECs books or initiated PECs communication independently, which is a problem that we sometimes see. So he would really only use the PECs book when he was asked to do so. And so these authors implemented a fixed interval prompting procedure in order to and successfully produced an increase in spontaneous PECs use. Still and colleagues evaluated an equivalence-based procedure for teaching children to man for items by selecting textual stimuli or printed words on a touchscreen. So they specifically first taught the children to man by selecting pictures on the touchscreen. They then taught them to select each picture given its spoken name or the spoken name of the item shown in the picture. They then taught them to select the printed name of each item given its spoken name. And they found that 10 of the 11 participants were able to man for missing items by selecting their printed name. So this study essentially demonstrates how you can transition students from picture-based to text-based communication. And some of the children in this study required a large number of training trials, but most of them actually did not. So most of them learned this pretty easily. But now they were all at somewhat different levels of functioning, is important to note. A study by, excuse me. In a study by Josik and colleagues, this is a study from the Marcus Institute. They evaluated the effects of behavioral intervention on the mean length of utterance in vocal manting, or MLU. MLU refers to essentially the number of morphemes that an individual emits in a single utterance, a morpheme being like the smallest meaningful unit of speech. So for example, car is 1 morpheme. Cars is 2 morphemes because it indicates a car and it also indicates plurality. Okay, so MLU is basically computed by observing a large number of an individual's utterances and then averaging the number of morphemes per utterance. And so what they did in this study was they essentially looked at existing data. So this was a retrospective analysis of archival data for 30 children who had undergone intervention specifically directed at increasing their MLU when manting. And they found that MLU increased with intervention, and for a majority of participants, the effect was large. So with behavioral intervention, specifically the protocol that they were employing at Marcus, it was possible to increase mean length of utterance substantially. Finally, Pence and St. Peter evaluated the effects of treatment integrity on vocal mand acquisition in 2 experiments. And 3 of their 6 participants had autism diagnoses, the others did not. These participants had pretty extensive vocal repertoires already. So in the study, they were taught to use nonsense names to man for preferred toys. Again, the study did not focus so much on teaching them a functional skill as it focused on evaluating the effects of errors made during mand training. And they found that, not surprisingly, mand acquisition was slower in conditions that included programmed lapses in treatment integrity. In experiment 1, they saw this effect when the incorrect toy was intermittently delivered contingent on a mant instead of the correct toy. And in experiment 2, they found this effect when the toy was sometimes delivered independently of a response. And of course, these lapses represent events that may occur commonly in home settings and in an individual's natural environment. And it did look like they somewhat impeded mant acquisition. The fourth category of studies I'm going to talk about focused on promoting variability in the form of manting. Why would we want to do that? Well, first, invariant mant topographies, such as always asking for things by saying, I want, may actually reduce an individual's access to reinforcement in the natural environment because people may be more likely to reinforce mants that are delivered or that are emitted with more variable topographies. And also it's possible that having multiple appropriate mant topographies for the same reinforcer may prevent resurgence of problem behavior that function to access the same reinforcer when reinforcement of an appropriate mant is delayed or omitted. So basically, it may be beneficial to have another topography available in case the first one doesn't work. And so 5 studies in the last 2 years focused on promoting variability in manting. And I'm going to highlight a study by Drasko and colleagues that appeared in Behavior Modification. They wanted to know if teaching children to alternate between 2 mant forms would prevent resurgence to pre-existing mants when the newly acquired mants were not reinforced immediately. Okay, their participants were 3 children. They were diagnosed with ASD in the severe range. They did not have any vocal communication, and they typically manted for items and activities by reaching or by leading people to those items. And in the study, the participants were taught to emit signed mants that corresponded to please and more to access a variety of preferred items or preferred foods specifically. The investigators then assessed mant forms that occurred under first immediate reinforcement conditions where mants were reinforced immediately, and delayed reinforcement condition where there was a 6 to 7 delay to reinforcement, after which the first mant that occurred after that was reinforced. So essentially the child emitted a mant, nothing happened for 6 to 7 seconds. After 6 to 7 seconds the child could mant again and that mant would be reinforced. Okay, so this is a pretty complex graph, but I think it's best to explain the procedures by showing the context of the graph. If you look at the different colored circles and squares and so on, they represent so first of all, circles represent existing mants, so those are the leading and reaching topographies. The squares represent the signed mant more, and the diamonds represent the signed mant please. Open circles represent immediate reinforcement conditions, so where mants were reinforced immediately. And the closed or the filled, so open symbols basically represent trials where the mant was reinforced immediately. Closed symbols represent trials where reinforcement was delayed. And here we are looking only at the first response in each trial, including delayed reinforcement trials. So in baseline, all mants are reinforced. The gray symbols represent generalization and maintenance probes, but just ignore these for right now and focus on the black, the filled, and the open circles. So in baseline, all mants are reinforced, including existing mants, so leading and reaching. And basically what this part of the graph shows is that what happened in every single trial is that the child would lead or reach for the item. Okay? And so this is just data from one participant. The other participants' data looked pretty similar. So This is the first part of the intervention. Here he is being taught to emit the sign for more when food is out of reach and he's showing interest in it. So they basically used physical prompting of gradually decreasing intensity to establish that signed band. And here you see a test phase when, again, all mands are reinforced, including reaching and leading. And we see here that there's a decrease in existing mands, which is the circles. And typically he responds immediately with the sign for more, even under delayed reinforcement conditions. Similarly, they go on to teach the mands for please, and then test, again in the same way. All topographies are reinforced during the test. And we see that at the beginning of training, the response more is predominant, but then he eventually switches to please, and please increases to mastery. And the test phase, please, is the predominant response when all mands are reinforced, regardless of whether reinforcement is immediate or delayed. So the next phase here is the really interesting one. So this is where the participants were taught to alternate between the two responses, more and please, when reinforcement was delayed. So during alternation, they reinforced only whatever mand occurred second in a delayed reinforcement trial. And it had to be, so basically, if the second mand was identical to the first mand, so if the child manded more and then manded more again, then they prompted the other mand, so then they would prompt please. And if the child alternated without prompting, then that was reinforced immediately. And so the triangles, which are only present in this phase, they may be hard to see, but they represent trials in which the child actually alternated, and we see that they successfully acquired this repertoire of alternating between the two trained mands. And in the test phase after that, there was no single response that predominated. They alternated in delayed reinforcement trials and used both the mands more and please. And here what you see for one of the participants, I think this is actually a different participant, but this is a closer look at what was happening in the delayed reinforcement trials when the first response was not reinforced immediately. So the upper panel here shows baseline data. So the bar on the far right shows which response was the first to occur in delayed reinforcement trials. And then the next cluster of bars shows which responses occurred second when the first did not get reinforced. And then we see to the right of that, we see which response occurred third and fourth and so on. And we see that in baseline, the participant is in most trials trying to reach for the item, and if that doesn't work, that it doesn't get reinforced, he usually tries again or tries to grab the therapist and lead them to the item. After the more mand is taught, now the participant's first response in each trial is more, and more is also typically the second response. So if more doesn't get reinforced, he mands more again. After the please mand is taught, we similarly see that he starts by saying please in each trial. If that doesn't get reinforced, he emits that sign again and then repeats it again and again. And finally, after alternation is taught, we see that at the beginning of trial, the beginning of the delayed reinforcement trial, he sometimes mands more and sometimes mands please, so we see some more variability. And in this case, more, which is the white bar, is a little bit more prevalent. If that doesn't get, when the first response doesn't get reinforced, he usually switches to the next one. So if he started with more, he goes to please. So in the second, if you look at the second response, please is actually more prevalent, whereas it was more in the more was more prevalent as the first response, and then continues to alternate until a response gets reinforced. So to summarize, all three participants successfully acquired the two mands, and they emitted the two mands in the presence of novel social partners. They successfully learned to alternate between the two new mands when the first mand emitted in a trial was not reinforced. Only 2 of them, though, continued to alternate in the last test condition. The other one reverted to simply using one form of the trained mans. But for the 2 who alternated, the alternation also generalized to novel social partners. And again, the 3rd participant persisted in just repeating, when tested, persisted in repeating the for whatever man was emitted first over and over again. In the study, however, there actually was minimal resurgence of the existing mans for all of the participants throughout the study. So once they had acquired a single mant, there just wasn't much leading or reaching anymore. So they didn't really get a chance to evaluate whether teaching the participants to alternate between the 2 forms really did affect resurgence, because there just wasn't much resurgence of those existing mans to begin with. And that may have been because the delays to reinforcement were brief, only 6 to 7 seconds, and you may be more likely to see resurgence of the existing response forms if they go unreinforced for a longer, or if the new ones go unreinforced for a longer period of time. Okay, for other studies in this category, Chazen and colleagues conducted a study that was very similar to the study I just talked about, but targeted negatively reinforced mans. The existing man forms in that study were pushing non-preferred items away, and they learned 2 new forms that involved picking up a rejection card and shaking their heads. Both of the participants learned both of the man forms, and one of the 2 alternated between the 2 forms in the delayed reinforcement test condition. Sellers and colleagues targeted variability in manned frames. So their participants each had a default manned frame. In most cases, that was "I want" item, and they taught them additional manned frames that included "May I have" and "I would like" and "Please give me." They used textual scripts and script fading to teach these 3 new frames. They taught the frames simultaneously, as opposed to a previous study that had taught them one by one and not actually gotten much of an effect on manned variability. For 3 of 6 participants, they found increased variability in manned frames when all frames were reinforced. But for 2 additional participants, variability increased when they implemented extinction for repeating a manned frame within a session. Broadhead and colleagues also used textual scripts and script fading to teach 3 new manned frames. They then combined instruction with lag reinforcement schedule, in which a mand was reinforced only if it was framed differently from the last mand, or the last 2 mands in the case of a lag 2 schedule, or the last 3 mands in the case of a lag 3 schedule. I think they only used lag 2 and 3 schedules. And they compared manting under lag reinforcement conditions to manting when only the default mand was reinforced and the new mands were not, or the new mand frames were not. They found that what was interesting about this study was that all the participants showed increased variability in manting, and that variability persisted when they withdrew the contingencies, when they withdrew the lag contingency and the no vary contingency and simply started reinforcing all manned frames. Okay, what happened in that phase, and we see this here for one participant, the triangles represent, so basically what they did, what remained in place was colored placemats that had signaled either lag reinforcement or reinforcement for not varying, for using the default manned frame. And what they found was that simply presenting the colored placemat that had signaled lag reinforcement resulted in variability, a greater number of manned frames appearing in each session than when they presented the signal for not varying. So that was pretty cool, even though all mands were reinforced in this condition no matter what. Adami and colleagues also found increased variability in MANT forms under a LAG-1 schedule of reinforcement compared to when they reinforced all forms of MANT. So this was a functional communication training study, and they found that the lag reinforcement contingency did not negatively affect the occurrence of problem behavior. Okay, I think I have time to talk about maybe one more category of studies before we take a break. That was studies on decreasing high rates of manting. So sometimes mants occur at impractically high rates for that just make it impossible for caregivers to reinforce all mants. In some cases, high rates of manting may carry a health risk if all mants are reinforced when those are mants for unhealthy edible reinforcers. So 3 studies focused on decreasing high rates of manting. I'm going to focus on a study by Landa and Hanley that came out last year in JAPA. This was a study on using multiple schedules to decrease high rates of mantings. Multiple schedules is basically a fancy way to say that reinforcement for manting is available only at certain times, and those times are signaled. Okay, so in a previous study on with typical developing preschoolers, Tiger and colleagues compared 2 variations of a multiple schedule arrangement. So one arrangement where the availability of reinforcement for manting was signaled and extinction was signaled as well with different stimuli. And the other condition was where only the reinforcement condition was signaled and the extinction condition was unsignaled. Okay, so they found that both variations reduced rates of manting more effectively than a mixed schedule where the participants simply never knew if a mant would get reinforced or not, but participants preferred the arrangement where reinforcement was signaled but extinction was not. So Landa and Hanley decided to replicate that study with 2 adolescents who were diagnosed with autism and used PACs to mant for preferred edibles. And so the schedule correlated stimuli that they used were colored pages that they placed under the communication page in their PACS binder. So in the S plus S minus condition, if there was a green piece of paper under the communication page, then a mant would get reinforced. If there was a red page in the binder, then that meant that that mants would not get reinforced at this time. In the S plus only condition, they placed the green page under the communication page when mants were reinforced, but they did not signal extinction specifically. So the binder was simply the way that it normally was in extinction. And then they also used a mixed schedule where they put white binders, white sheets under the communication page, regardless of whether reinforcement or extinction was in effect. And then in all condition, they randomly alternated at reinforcement and extinction based on the description. This is kind of what I envision a session may have looked like. It may not be entirely accurate, but the sessions were 3 minutes, so they might have started with reinforcement for 5 seconds, all mants are reinforced, then extinction for 30 seconds, no mants are reinforced, reinforcement for 45 seconds, and so on and so forth. But there was always an equal amount of time under reinforcement and extinction conditions. So during reinforcement was basically an FR1 schedule, all mants reinforced. If participants manted during extinction, their communication icon was simply replaced in the book, and the mant was not reinforced. And so these are the data for both participants, one on the left and one on the right, from the 3 conditions. And if we start out looking at the middle panel here, this is the S plus condition where reinforcement was signaled with a green page and extinction was not signaled or signaled with a blank binder. And we see that after some experience with the contingencies, both of the participants begin to mant almost exclusively when reinforcement is available and not when it's not. And these are the discrimination indexes, which indicate almost perfect discrimination between reinforcement and extinction conditions. By contrast, we see that when both extinction and reinforcement are signaled, discrimination indexes are lower, and when there is no signaling, there is essentially no discrimination for one of the participants, the one on the left, and for the other, there is some discrimination. We see more manting during the S+, presumably just because he tries every once in a while, and if the mant gets reinforced, he continues manting. If it doesn't, he stops for a while. So for one of the participants, the left one, Jack, the S+ only arrangement was the only one that produced good discriminated manting, and it produced the highest level of discrimination. For the other, for Max, they were able to thin the schedule to 1 minute of reinforcement to 30 seconds of extinction. I think it was the other way around. 30 seconds of reinforcement to 1 minute of extinction, while manting remained low. So these data seem to support signaling periods of availability of reinforcement for manting, but not requiring a discrimination between discrete signals for availability and unavailability. I don't think these data say that necessarily that you shouldn't signal extinction, because they didn't include a condition where extinction only was signaled and reinforcement was not. Okay, and it could be argued that sometimes that may be the logical thing to do, because sometimes, you know, it may be the case in the natural environment that usually reinforcement for manting is available, but occasionally it's not. So, for example, attention from mom may usually be available, but not when she's on the phone, okay, or doing a few other things. So in those cases, it might make more sense to signal extinction. And this study doesn't specifically say that you shouldn't do that, only that you shouldn't require a discrimination between a signal for reinforcement and a signal for extinction. So maybe just signal one of them. Okay. 2 other studies also evaluated multiple schedule arrangements. And I think since 10:30, I think, is the cutoff for the food out there. So I think maybe we should just take a break right now and come back here at 10:30. Does that work for everyone? All right. So we left off talking about studies, or I just told you about a study on reducing high-rate manting. There were 2 other studies in that category. Both of them also evaluated the use of multiple schedules. One study used naturalistic activities, such as an adult working, an adult talking on the phone, an adult attending to a baby doll. They used these activities as the signals for extinction and taught the participants to attend to these stimuli and successfully achieve discriminating manting and increase the duration of extinction per each period of reinforcement. The Chazen et al. Study actually signaled both reinforcement and extinction with discrete stimuli, and they were able to achieve discriminated manting as well and increase the duration of the extinction component of the schedule while providing alternative activities during extinction. But the next category of studies I'm going to talk about is studies on teaching mants for information. So sometimes the reinforcer for a mant is not a preferred item or the removal of non-preferred or an aversive stimulus, but simply the reinforcer is information that is provided by another person. I think that's often the case, for example, in adult speech. And mants for information may take the form of WH questions like where, who, why, which, and so on. Or it may take the form of a more general request. For example, I don't know, please tell me. How many of you have taught mants for information to a child? Some of you have. Okay, so which ones do you have experience teaching? All of them? Yeah. Who and where? Exactly. And so who and where are usually the beginning mants to teach, like you said, and maybe some of the ones some of the demands for information that are maybe easiest to teach, and then you get into more complex issues when you start trying to teach how or when or why even. But in any case, there were 4 studies in the last 2 years that have focused on teaching demands for information, and I'm going to talk about a study by, again, Robin Landa. This was a study that she conducted with colleagues at the Marcus Institute and was published earlier this year in JABA. And so this was a study on teaching when demands for information. So there was a previous study that had demonstrated a procedure for doing that, but they didn't include a conclusive demonstration of functional control by a relevant EO. Basically, in the previous study, they didn't demonstrate that the child would only ask when that information was needed, or when the information provided by the answer was actually needed. So this study was designed to address that limitation. So the participants were 3, 6, and 7-year-old children, and 2 of them already had some demands for information, what, who, and which, and 1 of them did not. And the target behavior in this study was to ask when a demand for a preferred item was denied, with a statement like, not right now, or you can have that later. Okay, so the consequence for asking when was a statement. So the consequence was not that the child would be told the time at which a demand would be reinforced. Rather, they were given a contingency specifying statement, such as, you can have it after you wash your hands. So they were basically told that they had to do something first, and then they could have the item they had demanded for. So before teaching the when demand, the participants were first taught to respond to that contingency specifying statement to complete the behavioral requirements. So at the beginning of each trial, a preferred item, so let's say the preferred item was chips. The chips would be visible but out of the child's reach, and it would be determined ahead of time that the child actually wanted. The chips were valuable as a reinforcer at that time. Okay, when the child demanded for the chips, said, for example, may I have chips, please? They were told, not right now, after you put away your toys, or some other behavioral requirement. So there were several different ones that they used. And once the child had put away their toys, which was, so the task was taught if it was necessary, but in many cases it was not, because they already knew how to put away their toys, wash their hands, and so forth. So after they put away their toys, they had another opportunity to demand for the chips, and that demand would then get reinforced. As long as it occurred within 10 seconds of completing the task, they would then get access to the reinforcer for 30 seconds. Okay, so both baseline and instructional trials included both EO present trials and EO absent instructional trials. So in EO present trials, the participants were or should have been motivated to obtain information about what they needed to do to be able to demand for the chips or whatever the reinforcer was. So in an instructional trial, in an EO present instructional trial, the trial began again, the same way. The chips were visible but out of reach. If the child demanded for chips, they were told, not right now, but they were not told when that, they were not told what they needed to do to obtain the chips. They were then taught to respond to that statement by asking when. They used textual or echoic prompts and a prompt delay to teach that response. After they asked when, they were told, after you put away your toys. They could then go ahead and put away their toys as they had been taught to do, and ask again for the chips and get access to the chips for 30 seconds. Does that make sense? So basically the difference was that instead of immediately being told what they needed to do in order to obtain the chips, they had to ask when in order to obtain this information. Now you might ask, could the participant have simply guessed what the behavioral requirement was and what they needed to do to obtain the chips. For example, go put away their toys without asking when. They could have, but they reported that this was unlikely to happen and rarely happened because there were many different behavioral requirements that were alternated. So it was difficult for the participants to actually guess what the requirement was. I mean, if they did, then they could mand and the mand would be reinforced, but it would be difficult for them to guess because there were so many possible behavioral requirements. So they needed to ask when to find out what it was. And then there were also EO absent instructional trials where essentially it wasn't necessary to ask when in order to obtain information about the behavioral requirements. So here, if the child manded for chips, they were told, again, not right now, after you put away your toys. So they got the information right away, so there was no need to ask when. Then, if they went and put away their toys, they could mand for chips again, and they got access to the chips. If they did mand when, even though it wasn't necessary, they were told again, after you put away your toys, that information was simply repeated, and they could then put away their toys, ask for chips, and get the chips. So they got the chips regardless. Okay? It was just that, so they could ask when and, complete the whole sequence and get the chips. It was just that there shouldn't have been any need for them to ask when in these trials. So that was a crucial difference here. Whoops, I forgot to do this. Okay, when was, of course, never prompted in the EO absent trials. It was only prompted in the EO present trials. And in fact, this response rarely occurred in the EO absent trials. So these are data for one participant. Shows baseline training and post-training. No prompts are provided post-training. If you look at the open circles, these represent manding during AO trials where the participants already have the relevant information and they don't need to ask for it. And we see that this participant never mans when under those conditions. During training and post-training, however, you see the triangles here are prompted responses, which obviously decrease with training, whereas independent when responses represented by the closed circles increase during training. And post-training, she frequently mans when that information is needed. So basically, they showed that they could teach the when mand and demonstrate that that the participant had essentially learned to use that response under the correct stimulus conditions when information was needed and not when it was not, as opposed to just learning to rotely ask when they thought they were expected to, or under irrelevant stimulus conditions. This shows the same participant. It shows basically her completion of the behavior requirement. So what you see in baseline here is that in the EO present trials, where she wasn't given the information right away, she was never able to perform the behavior requirement and obtain the reinforcer. You see the closed circles are at 0 there. So if she didn't get the information, she couldn't obtain the reinforcer. During training and post-training, she always successfully obtained the information and completed the requirement and obtained the reinforcers. So all of the participants acquired the when mand and emitted these mands exclusively or almost exclusively when they needed to do so in EO present trials. And only after acquiring this mand were the participants able to successfully complete the behavior requirement. And in baseline, you didn't see this in the graphs, but in baseline, excuse me, the initial mand for the item, so for example, may I have chips, typically persisted after that request was denied in EO trial. So if they were told, not right now, they would ask again, may I have chips, may I have chips, may I have chips? And that inappropriate asking decrease pretty much went away once they learned the appropriate when mand. And maybe the only limitation of that study was that when is usually a question about time, and they didn't actually include any answers that were about time specifically. Okay, you can have chips at 4 o'clock, you can have chips at 12 o'clock, maybe because these participants couldn't tell time. So that's a topic for future research. So as for the other studies in this category, Schillingsberg and colleagues used textual prompts to teach who mans for information to 4 children who all acquired the target response and emitted it in EO present trials, but not in EO absent trials where they already had the relevant information pertaining to who had the item that they wanted at that time. In another study by Schillingsberg and colleagues, they taught children with autism to man for social information. In a third study by Carnett and Ingvarsson, they worked with an 11-year-old boy who was functioning in the severe range of ASD, but at some point had learned to communicate in writing and was now communicating by typing into a speech-generating device. And so in this study, they taught him to type, "I don't know, please tell me," when he was asked a question that he didn't know the answer to. So the questions were questions about the functions of objects, like what do you do with a bike? If he made a correct interverbal response with using his SGD, then that was reinforced. If he didn't know the answer, he was prompted to type, "I don't know, please tell me," and was then provided with the answer both vocally and textually on a card. And so he acquired the "I don't know, please tell me" response. He emitted it only in response to questions when he didn't know the answer. He did not start also saying, "I don't know, please tell me," if he already knew the answer. And he also, additionally, he learned to answer questions for which he initially had to man for the answer. So that was neat in this study. And yeah, so that was all the studies on mans for information. So moving on to tacts and interverbals, the next set of studies I'm going to talk about address procedural variables in tact and interverbal instructions. So as I'm sure you know, tacts and interverbals, new tacts and interverbals, are often taught in discrete trial format. And so in research on discrete trials instruction, tacts and interverbals are often used as the acquisition targets. Okay? So in the next group of studies I'm going to talk about, there were some studies that addressed questions that may be applicable to teaching many different skills, not necessarily just tacts or interverbals or other verbal operands, but just teaching skills in general. And some of the other studies addressed variables that are maybe more specific to tact or interverbal instructions, like what type of prompts to use when teaching interverbals. So there were, a total of, is that eight studies that fell into this category. And I've chosen a study by Carivo and colleagues. This is a study out of Tiffany Kodak's lab to highlight. This is a study that was published in JABA last year. And these investigators evaluated the effects of masked versus varied instructional trials and of intertrial interval duration on the acquisition of tacts and interverbals. Now, both of these variables, masking versus varying trials and intertrial interval duration, both of these variables have been evaluated in prior research, but not combined before. So that's what they did in this study. Participants were 2 children, 7 and 9 years old. Their instructional targets were animal sound interverbals for one child, like what does a cat say, and novel tacts for the other one. And so for each child, they selected 24 unmastered targets and assigned them to 6 different conditions. And within each condition, they taught the novel targets using progressive prompt delay with a terminal value of 10 seconds. And of course, they differentially, not necessarily, of course, as we'll see later, but they differentially reinforced unprompted responses once they had obtained a single unprompted correct response. Okay, so they had a masked trial condition in which, so all of their sessions were 9 trials, and they had a masked trial condition in which they presented the same instructional target in all 9 trials within each session. So just over and over again, what does a cat say? Okay, great job. What does a cat say? Okay, and so on. And they contrasted this with a varied trials condition where they used 3 instructional targets that were presented 3 times each within a session. And no target would be presented more than twice in a row. So within a single session, they might target what does a cat say, what does a dog say, and what does a pig say. And they would just mix these trials up. So within each one of these sessions, they looked at 3 different intertrial interval durations. Short ITI was 2 seconds. So after reinforcing a response, they waited only 2 seconds before they started the next trial. So that represented fast-paced instruction. They also had a long ITI condition where after reinforcing a correct response, they waited 20 seconds to start the next trial, which represents kind of slow-paced instruction with maybe time being spent between trials, like organizing materials and recording data and things like that. They also looked at a progressive ITI condition where they started out with short ITIs and gradually increased the length of the ITI until it reached 20 seconds. Okay, so both of the participants acquired all of the tacts in all of the conditions, and this graph shows the number of instructional trials to acquisition in each condition. So participant Beth, you see the 2 top rows of graphs are the graphs for one of the participants, and the bottom 2 rows are for the other participant. And basically what you see here is, without necessarily describing it in detail, and also I just realized you can't see the entire graph. You can't see the bottom of my slides, can you? All right, so basically what it shows is that when instructional trials were varied within a session, acquisition was usually faster, so fewer trials were needed than during mass trial instruction. And mass trial instruction was particularly detrimental if the ITI was long. So that's where you're seeing the highest bars is in those conditions where trials are massed and you have a long ITI. Does that make sense? And so the reason there are 2 rows of graphs for each participant is that each participant underwent 2 evaluations. The data were generally similar for both of them. So basically, varied trials produce faster acquisition than mass trials, and this effect was most pronounced when instruction was slow-paced. And overall, fast-paced instruction with varied targets where the trials were all mixed up produced the fastest acquisition for both of the participants, which I think is actually consistent with a recommendation that's often made in the verbal behavior literature, but I think has actually been based more on clinical experience than on empirical data. So these data kind of provide support for that recommendation to make instruction fast-paced and varying the targets. Okay, once the targets were mastered, generalization and maintenance, it varied a little bit across participants and targets, but didn't seem to depend on how the targets had been taught. So the different conditions did not necessarily affect generalization once the target was mastered. As for other studies in this category, excuse me, there were 2 studies that compared the effects of different differential reinforcement procedures on the acquisition of tacts and interverbals. So specifically, they were interested in the differential reinforcement of unprompted responses relative to prompted responses that were responses emitted following a prompt. So both studies looked at the effects of providing a greater amount of a reinforcer for unprompted than prompted responses. Both of them also investigated effects of providing a higher quality reinforcer for unprompted than prompted responses. And in addition, one of the studies evaluated the effects of providing a denser schedule of reinforcement for unprompted than prompted responses. They also both included non-differential reinforcement conditions in which the better reinforcer or magnitude or quality or what have you was delivered for both prompted and unprompted responses. So in one of the studies, it was found that all of the participants acquired all of the target responses, and there was no consistent effect of the differential reinforcement procedures. Non-differential reinforcement, in fact, was just as good as all of the differential reinforcement procedures. It didn't really matter whether or how unprompted responses were reinforced in that study. In the other study, they actually were able to, so this was they started in the context of teaching listener skills. In that context, they actually were able to identify a best differential reinforcement procedure for each participant, and which procedure that was differed across participants. They found that this best procedure, when they then went on to compare all the procedures again during listener training, they found that the best procedure was, again, the best procedure for listener targets. However, when they compared the same procedures while teaching tact or interverbals, they found that whichever procedure worked best for a participant for teaching listener skills was not necessarily the differential reinforcement procedure that worked best while teaching tacts and interverbals. So that was a kind of an interesting finding. So you may need to, so it may be most efficient to sometimes use differential reinforcement of unprompted responses and sometimes not to, depending on what exactly is being taught. All right. Another study evaluated the effects of delays to reinforcement on the acquisition of tact, and found, not surprisingly, that delays were detrimental to acquisition. That delays as brief as 6 seconds to reinforcement slowed acquisition for 2 of the 3 participants. A study by Leaf and colleagues evaluated the effects of, this one is interesting, of multiple alternative prompts following error correction or actually as part of following error responses during tact instruction. I'm sorry. And so what that looked like was if in a tact trial, the participant made an incorrect response, they would give the participant 3 options. Instead of going on to immediately deliver, let's say, a vocal prompt and say it's a drill, they gave the participant 3 options and asked, is it a hammer, a drill, or a screwdriver? Has anybody used this type of prompt systematically before? Nope. Okay, so I think this is interesting because it kind of represents a prompt that is maybe a little bit less intrusive than immediately telling the child the answer, and maybe a little bit more playful too. And what they basically found was they compared acquisition of tacts when they used this multiple alternative prompts to acquisition using just a conventional model prompt. So when the participant would just be told it's a drill, and they would echo that response. They found that trials to criterion and the time that it took to teach all of the target tacts was equal in both of the conditions. So basically using the multiple alternative prompts did not slow acquisition or impede the efficiency of instruction. They had some preliminary data suggesting that maybe the tacts taught with the multiple alternative prompts were maintained better, but these data were preliminary because actually maintenance was pretty good in both of the conditions. I would have loved to see a preference assessment in the study, because I started thinking about, well, why would you want to use the multiple alternative prompt? And I thought, well, maybe because it is kind of more playful. Maybe some kids prefer it. But they didn't actually include an evaluation of child preference. I thought that might have been interesting to see. Vidura and Conant compared the efficiency of visual prompts and echoic prompts on interverbal acquisition of 3 young adults with ASD diagnoses. And so this had been done previously in several studies, but those were all studies with young children. Again, this study was conducted with adults. The results were idiosyncratic across participants. And as the authors, so basically one had the fastest acquisition with echoic prompts and the other with textual prompts. And one with textual prompts, and the third participant had equal acquisition rates in both conditions. And as they pointed out, the participants' instructional history may have played a role, because there was a study came out a few years ago by Kuhn and Miguel that suggested that the type of prompt that works best for each individual may often be simply the type of prompt that they have most often experienced recently. Shion and colleagues found that the effectiveness of textual prompts when they were teaching interverbals did not depend on the fluency of the textual response. So basically, as long as the participants were able to respond to a textual prompt, it didn't matter if that response was fluent or not when it came to the effect on intraverbal acquisition. And finally, Giuntafede and colleagues evaluated the effects of different data collection practices during TACT instruction, and they found that collecting data on all responses during instruction was associated with faster acquisition than when the researchers collected data only on the the response in the first trial of the session or the day. There were no differences in generalization or maintenance, but the mastery criterion was reached faster when data were collected more frequently or continuously. All right, next category of study is on establishing complex stimulus control over TACTs and interverbals. Now, what do I mean by complex stimulus control? I mean that we are looking at something more complex than simple stimulus control, in which you have a single response unit such as car that's under the control of a single class of stimuli. So we have a student who's learned that in the presence of cars, the TACT car will be reinforced, most likely not in the absence of cars or in the presence of non-cars that the child is asked to TACT. Okay, but in mature, so that's what I would call a simple TACT. In a mature speech, it may more often be the case that the form of a particular response is controlled by multiple stimuli that are present in the situation, or that we are emitting verbal responses controlled by different stimuli in rapid succession. So, for example, subject-verb sentence construction, like saying the boy is jumping, so the TACT, the boy is jumping, requires rapidly TACTing multiple stimuli or different aspects of a stimulus in rapid succession, so both the boy and the action of jumping. And answering a question like what color is a tiger requires a control by at least two elements of the antecedent stimulus, that is color and tiger. So you would answer this question differently than if you were asked what color is an elephant or where does a tiger live. Okay, so there were, these studies were pretty heterogeneous, but there were 7 studies total that in some way addressed complex stimulus control over TACTs and interverbals. And now I have to acknowledge, I'm going to highlight a study by Ingvarsson and colleagues, and I have to acknowledge that my criteria for selecting this study to highlight may not have been exactly impartial because I'm a co-author on it as well. But the target behavior in this study was interverbal responses to pairs of questions that required discriminating the presence or absence of the preposition with. So, for example, what do you sweep versus what do you sweep with? Or what do you eat versus what do you eat with? So the participants were 4 children, 6 to 8 years old with AC diagnoses, and they'd previously mastered a number of interverbal programs, but they did have difficulty with questions that required control by multiple stimuli. Okay, so in this study, we evaluated the use of blocked trials discrimination to establish discrimination between these the 2 questions in each pair. Okay, so what's a blocked trials procedure? Well, here's what our protocol looks like. So basically in block trials instruction, you start out mass trialing each of 2 targets, and then you so first you deliver many trials in a row for each target, and then switch to the other one, deliver many trials for that target, switch to the other one, and then gradually reduce the size of the trial blocks for each target until you are kind of alternating randomly between the two. So in this protocol, we started with step 3. I know that doesn't make sense, but we started all participants with step 3, where we presented the first question, for example, what do you sweep with, until we got 5 consecutive correct unprompted responses. Then presented the second question, for example, what do you sweep, until we got 5 consecutive correct responses, switched back to the first question, back to the second question, and so on, until we had 4 consecutive trial blocks without errors, or a total of 20 correct responses in blocks of 5. We then went to step 4, where we substantially reduced the size of the trial blocks so we started asking each question either 2 or 3 times in a row before switching to the other. Continued that until we got 15 consecutive correct responses that included responses, approximately an equal number of responses to both questions. Then moved on to step 5, in which presentation was semi-random and no question was ever presented more than twice in a row. So if participants were not able to get through step 3, which was again the first step, we backed down to steps 1 and 2. And that only happened for one of the participants. So in step 1, we essentially went to larger trial blocks and we asked each question over and over again until we had 10 consecutive correct responses. And in step 2, until we had 8 consecutive correct responses. Then went to step 3, in which 5 correct responses were required. Okay, here are the data from one of the participants, Danny, and I know this display is a little bit unconventional, so let me try to explain. The x-axis shows the sessions, and along the y-axis you see the pairs of questions. So you have question pair 1 at the top, which is the first one that was taught, then question pair 2, 3, 4, and so on. For example, pair 1 might be, what do you sweep versus what do you sweep with? And 2 might be, what do you eat versus what do you eat with, and so forth. So in baseline, that's the first 3 rows of numbers there. In baseline, all of the questions are probed. Excuse me. All of the questions are probed, so all of the question pairs are probed 4 times each within each of the 3 baseline sessions. And what you see here is that Danny is usually getting 0, 1, or correct responses in each probe in baseline. Usually he's getting 2 correct responses in baseline. So what do you think that means? He's giving the same response regardless of whether with is a part of the question or not. So when he's asked, what do you eat with? He might be saying spoon every time correctly. But when asked, what do you eat? He's also saying spoon. So that's what's happening at baseline. He's answering both questions in each pair the same way. Okay, so the black line represents instruction, and everything that comes after the black line represents post-training probes. What this basically shows in summary is that the question pairs get trained, and then typically Danny passes probes after that. Once the first 6 question pairs have been trained and successfully acquired, we see generalization to the 2 remaining question pairs. So he actually starts discriminating between the questions in the remaining 2 question pairs. However, Danny was the only participant we saw any generalization with. The other participants required instruction with all 8 pairs of questions. Now, what you see in this graph is performance in what we called criterion level probes that were conducted with 2 of the participants, unfortunately only 2 of them, in baseline, and then after the block trials protocol had been implemented for all 8 question pairs. So the criterion level probes were essentially step 5 instruction, where there was random alternation between questions, but they were done with novel question pairs that were not included in instruction. So basically, what we wanted to know was if the participant could learn when the questions were alternated randomly, as opposed to needing the block trials protocol. What this graph specifically shows is the number of times it was necessary to prompt a correct response in a probe. At pre-test, which is the open circles, we see that much more prompting is required than during the post-test, suggesting that at pre-test, the participants had difficulty, as we already know, difficulty learning when the questions were presented semi-randomly, but after going through the block trials protocol with the 8 question pairs, they could now learn from instruction basically in step 5 without going through the entire protocol. So a limitation of this study, well, first, just to summarize, all of the participants, because I only showed you one here, all participants acquired the targeted interverbals with the block trials procedure, and in some cases, remedial procedures were necessary, like, so there was one participant who, when we got to step 5, he would always repeat whichever response was correct on the last trial. So even though he'd been doing okay when there were more identical trials in a row, once they started alternating more frequently, he started just using this win-stay strategy and repeating whatever got reinforced last. So we had to insert some distractor trials to stop that. There was another participant who, what was that? Oh, we had to teach him to respond with only one word, because he would respond to all questions with a sentence that always included the word with, whether or not that was appropriate. There was little generalization to untrained targets, so that was a limitation. But we did see that following instruction with the 8 question pairs, the participants no longer required block trials instruction, so they learned some generalized, there was some learning to learn going on there. A limitation, though, is that the criterion probes were only done before and after the entire protocol, so it may be that we continued instruction with the block trials protocol longer than we really needed to. It's possible that the participants were ready for random alternation much earlier than we knew in this study. Okay, so this limitation was addressed in another study by Hager and colleagues that replicated the previous one and inserted criterion level probes after teaching each question pair. The 2 participants who finished this study acquired all the targets, and after the first discrimination was established, that it was actually rarely necessary to use the block trials protocol. So basically, once they'd been through it once, learned to discriminate a question that included with from a question that didn't, they learned others much more easily. Oh, yeah. As for other studies, Kaisermore and colleagues, they also taught interverbal responses that required control by multiple components of the verbal stimulus. For example, what's an animal that's red versus what's an animal that's yellow versus what's a vehicle that's red versus what's a vehicle that's yellow. In order to answer these questions correctly, you have to attend to at least 2 elements of each stimulus. And they found that they had 7 participants total. 3 of them acquired all of the targets using simply prompt delay plus an error correction procedure, so they acquired them pretty easily. 4 participants did not acquire the target interverbals easily, but they did acquire them after they used several additional procedures, and those additional procedures they included differential observing responses, where the participants were asked to repeat the crucial components of the verbal stimulus before answering the question. So, for example, if they were asked what is an animal that's red, they would be prompted to repeat animal red before actually answering the question. And they also tried a block trials protocol with 1 participant. Didn't actually work for that participant. But basically, they were eventually successful in teaching the target responses to everyone, but they all needed different instructional modifications. And then Contreras and Betts, addressed variability in intraverbal listing responses to category questions. So those are questions like, what are some animals, what are some kitchen items, what are some musical instruments, and so on. And so their participants exhibited rote responses to these types of questions. So when asked what are some animals, they would always answer cat, dog, pig in that exact order, and never name any other animals or mix up the order. So suggesting that for these participants, supplemental sources of stimulus control that might promote more variability were not present. So what they did was they tried to simply implement a lag reinforcement schedule to increase variability. And for two of three participants, that was sufficient to increase variability in responding. So basically, they just did not reinforce responses that were exactly identical to the previous response. The participants had to change something, list the animals in a different order, list a new animal, and so forth. One of these two participants also began to emit a variety of novel responses without any instructions. So whereas before he might only have said cat, dog, pig, he now started saying cow, horse, tiger, and so forth. And the third participant required a little bit more training, but they successfully were able to, so he basically needed to be prompted to vary his responding so that he would contact the lag reinforcement contingency because his responses were so invariable in the beginning that there was nothing to reinforce. But once he contacted the lag reinforcement contingency, they saw variability increase for that participant as well. Two studies evaluated the effects of matrix training on recombinated generalization when teaching children to emit phrases that either required tacting items and their relative location, such as the strainer is to the right of the box, or tacting an actor performing an action, like, for example, cat jumping, okay? So matrix training is basically a way of arranging the training and testing for these types of instructional targets in such a way to maximize the efficiency of instruction. So as an example, a matrix for the target responses used in the study by Frampton and colleagues could look like this, and this is not an actual matrix from their study, I just made this one up. So basically what you have here is you have the actors you list the actors vertically here, you list the actions horizontally, and then the essentially the target, you start out by training the, excuse me, whoops, here we go. So you start out training a set of targets that includes only each actor once and each action once. So you essentially train the diagonal cells in the matrix. You train cat jumping, boy running, dog sleeping, pig eating, and so on in this case. And then you test the white cells to see if you get generalization to boy jumping, dog jumping, cat running, and so forth. So in both of these studies, most of the participants did show recombinated generalization. So basically, when the white cells were tested, they responded correctly after the training of only the diagonal cells in one matrix. And the remainder of the participants did start showing recombinated generalization after some additional training. In one study, there was also a demonstration of generalization to matrices in which no combinations of verbs and nouns were ever trained. So those were simply matrices where the participants could already tact the verbs and tact the actors and the actions, but they had just not previously combined these tacts. Connellan and Reed evaluated a procedure for teaching children to tact emotions using iconic picture cards. So their participants were 10 children with no vocal communication. They communicated with a picture-based system The intervention consisted of teaching them to match situation cards to emotion cards and vice versa. So situation cards were line drawings that showed a child in an emotion-producing situation. So for example, a boy celebrating his birthday or a child whose balloon had just burst. And the emotion cards so on the situation cards, although there was a child on each card, the child had an ambiguous facial expression. So, and they were taught to match these cards to emotion cards that included a face that looked either happy, angry, or sad. And they refer to these as, so matching the faces to the situation cards, they refer to that as selection-based tact, basically. So the verbal response was pointing to a face. Okay, so, and they found that the response generalized, these selection-based tasks generalized to novel situation cards showing novel emotion-producing situations, and also generalized to selecting novel situation cards that matched the participants' own individual preferences when they were asked what makes you happy, what makes you sad, and so forth. Okay, so that was the last study in that category. The next category is, actually the next two categories involve the emergence of untaught intraverbals and tact. So we know that sometimes when we teach a skill, we will get another skill for free. So we get stimulus control by new verbal or nonverbal stimuli over responses that have never been reinforced in the presence of those specific stimuli. And this occurs as a result of some other instruction that has happened. A new intraverbal relation might emerge following mastery of a new tact, or vice versa. And we also probably know that sometimes this happens and sometimes it does not, right? So sometimes we teach one thing and we get something else for free, and sometimes we don't. So some questions worth asking include, for example, under which circumstances can we expect this to happen? Which student skills might be prerequisite for emergent tacts and interverbals to occur? And if we don't observe emergent tacts or interverbals when we might reasonably expect them, can we teach skills that promote emergence? And so there were a total of 7 studies that investigated the emergence of tacts and interverbals that had not been directly taught. I'm going to highlight a study by Schillingsberg and colleagues that came out earlier this year in Learning and Motivation. And so these authors evaluated the effects of listener instruction and tact instruction on the emergence of bidirectional intraverbal responding. Participants were 6 children with ASD diagnoses, 4 to 8 years old. And their target responses, some examples of the target responses, the target bidirectional intraverbal relations in this study included who lives in the sea? A fish does. Whereas, where does a fish live? Okay. Who says woof versus what does a dog say? And so on. Okay, so all of the participants first went through listener training, where in each trial they were given a question such as who lives in the sea, and they responded by selecting the appropriate picture. Interverbal responses were then probed to both who lives in the sea and where does a fish live, and of course all the other stimuli as well. And if interverbals did not emerge to criterion, the participant went on to tact training. In tact training, in each trial, the participant was shown a picture and taught to answer a question about it, such as where does this one live? Again, they were then given interverbal probes. Where does a fish live? Who lives in the sea? If the interverbals did not emerge, they were taught directly, with one of them first being taught to criterion and then the other one. So they were taught sequentially. All right, so to summarize the results, all of the participants showed some emergence of untrained interverbals after either tact or listener training. And in some cases, this happens after the very first set of interverbals was trained. So after the first one was trained, the second set emerged. For some, it happened a little bit later. And yeah, in some cases, if the intraverbals had to be trained directly, it was sometimes the case that after the first set of intraverbals had been taught in one direction, the reverse intraverbals emerged. But again, it wasn't always necessary to train the intraverbals directly because they had emerged as a result of tact and listener training. Basically, across participants and stimulus sets, between 1 out of 6 and 6 out of 6 relations in a set emerged without training, but there was variability across participants and across sets. For all 3 participants, no tacts or intraverbals emerged for the very first stimulus set until they were taught directly. So they began to emerge following tact or listener training when the procedure was then repeated with additional stimulus sets. And for 3 participants, for the other 3 participants, there were some intraverbals that emerged following listener instruction or tact instruction on the very first set. But in those cases, they did show improvements across subsequent sets. So basically, again, a learning to learn phenomenon. Like once you've been through this procedure with one set of stimuli, you essentially learn more when it is repeated with others. And 4 participants also demonstrated some emergence of untrained interverbals on sets that had not been trained at all. Another finding was that tact training was more likely to result in the emergence of the interverbal that shared a response form with the tact than the reverse interverbal. So learning to respond to where does this one live by selecting a picture of a fish was more likely to produce the response fish to where does a fish live than it was to reproduce the response in the sea to no, wait. Other way around. So learning this listener relation was more likely to produce a correct interverbal response to where does this one live than it was to the question where who lives in the sea. Okay. I think I said this the other way around though, because okay, so this is tact training, obviously. So if the participants learned to answer the question, where does this one live, while seeing the fish, they were more likely to answer the question, where does a fish live, than who lives in the sea. By contrast, if they received listener training, they learned to select the fish in response to who lives in the sea. They were more likely to be able to answer the interverbal question, who lives in the sea, than where does a fish live. So sorry about that. That was super confusing. Another thing that they didn't really discuss in the article, but overall, although they always started with listener training, so listener training had many more opportunities to produce emergent interverbals than did tact training, it was more often not until tact training that interverbals began to emerge. So there was actually overall more emergence following tact than interverbal training. All right. As for other studies in this category, Smith and colleagues found that interverbals for function feature questions that were similar to the Schillingsburg et al. Study. Questions like, what's a vehicle that flies in space? So these types of interverbals emerged following listener training alone for 4 of 5 of their participants, and also emerged for the 5th participant when the probing procedure was modified, so that the participant was actually required to tact the relevant item before answering the question. So tact a picture of a glass of milk before answering the question, what is a drink that's white? Okay. In this study, though, so all participants showed some emergence of new interverbal responding, but they didn't actually, in most cases, show emergence to mastery. Gion and colleagues with one participant found that after a participant, so they looked at essentially, again, interverbal listing responses to questions about categories like what are some animals, what are some vehicles, and they found that new interverbal responses to these types of questions began to emerge after the participant learned to tact the items in those categories to a fluency criterion. It wasn't super clear, though, if the fluency criterion was necessary or if it would have been sufficient to just learn to tact the items without a fluency criterion. Dix and Kodak taught children to interverbally answer questions about opposites and functions in animal sounds, and then assess the emergence of the reverse interverbals. So after learning to say the opposite of hot is cold, would they also be able to state that the opposite of cold is hot? All participants showed some emergence of the reverse interverbals, but it was a little bit limited. They did not perform at criterion again. They then went on to directly train a subset of the reverse interverbals in hopes that the remaining ones would now emerge, but they did not. Frampton and colleagues investigated the relative efficiency of listener training and tact training for establishing both tact and listener behavior. So their measures included how many skills were mastered, trials to criterion, emergence of untrained skills. So they were basically interested in, should you teach expressive before, should you teach receptive before expressive skills or not? Okay. So what they found was that actually tact training was more efficient than listener training for 6 of their 8 participants. And for the remaining 2 participants, tact and listener training were equally, in fact, effective in terms of the amount of effort that it took to establish both tact and listener repertoires. And that's consistent with prior studies on this topic. Olaf and colleagues looked at, okay, this one's a little bit complicated. They looked at emergence of tact and listener relations after having the participants perform an identity matching task with novel objects while echoing the names of those objects. Okay, so these were participants who already could perform identity matching. Okay, so they could match identical objects. So they were given new objects to match, objects that they couldn't tact, and while they were matching the objects, they heard the names of the items and were asked to echo the names of the items. So they wanted to know, would participants then be able to tact the items and respond as listeners to their names? They found that in most cases, no. They were not. But after receiving multiple exemplar training, where participants for a particular stimulus set, they essentially mixed up trials where they did the identity matching procedure. They mixed those up with actual tact and listener trials. And after that, they found that when they introduced yet new sets of objects, the participants were able to pick up some tact and listener relations just as a result of matching the objects while hearing their or echoing their names. Experimental control was a little bit limited, though, in this study, maybe. Finally, Lee and colleagues replicated a previous study on the effects of listener training on the emergence of tact and nonverbal categorization. So basically, participants in this study learned to respond as a listener to category labels, and the category labels were actually not dog breeds, but I guess a superordinate category of dog breeds. And so once they had learned to respond as listeners to the category labels, they tested to see if the participants could tact items in that category using the category label, and also to see if participants would match items that belong to the same category. And consistent with previous studies, they found that the 2 participants who were found to be able to tact following listener instruction, they also were able to match items that belong to the same category, whereas the 2 participants who were not able to tact using the category label following listener instruction also were not able to perform the matching task. And another category of study dealt with the use of instructive feedback to establish verbal or expand verbal repertoires. So what is instructive feedback? Well, in normal discrete trial instruction. As you know, our instructional trial consists of a stimulus, a response, and a consequence. So we reinforce a particular response class in the presence of a specific class of stimuli. And instructive feedback refers to incorporating stimuli that are extraneous to the target operand into some portion of the instructional trial. So we add something to this sequence of stimulus, response, consequence. Okay, as an example, a teacher might initiate a TAC trial by showing a student a picture of a cat and asking, "What is this?" The student then responds, it's a cat. The teacher reinforces that response and adds, and a cat says meow. So this last part, a cat says meow, is referred to as the instructional feedback stimulus, or the secondary target in the trial. And the student is not required to respond to the stimulus in any way, but later we essentially test to see if the student has learned anything new from being repeatedly exposed to the stimulus, exposed to this information. A cat says meow. If they have, then we've essentially gotten some extra bang for our buck. Okay, and in this case, the instructive feedback stimulus consists of essentially expanding on the correct response, but it doesn't necessarily have to be something that expands on the correct response. It can also be unrelated to the primary target. So, for example, the teacher could say, "That's right," then hold up a different picture and say, "And this is a pig." Okay? Again, the student doesn't have to respond in any way. Instructive feedback can be included. It doesn't have to be included in the consequence portion of a trial. It can also be included in the antecedent portion. As an example, the teacher might say, "A cow says moo, but a cat says what?" And the student then responds meow, and that response gets reinforced. The student does not have to respond to the stimulus, "A cow says moo," in any way. Okay, so research on instructive feedback has been around for a long time, but it's only recently that researchers have begun to extend it to discrete trials instruction with children who have autism diagnoses. I found 5 studies in the last 5 years on the use of instructive feedback for this population during the training of verbal operants. And I'm going to highlight a study by Nottingham and colleagues today. So they were interested in looking at the effects of incorporating multiple instructive feedback stimuli into a single trial. So they were actually replicating an older study by Gast and colleagues, but with a new population, which was children with autism, 2 participants in this study. Both the primary and secondary targets in this study were novel tacts. So a mango might be a primary target, and a pine cone might be a secondary target that was presented as instructive feedback and the child never required to respond to. They tested the secondary tacts at the beginning of each instructional session without any feedback or reinforcement. And they compared 4 instructional conditions. In one condition, there were no secondary targets, only primary targets. In one condition, an instructive feedback stimulus was presented in the consequence portion of each trial. In another condition, 2 instructive feedback stimuli were presented in the consequence portion of each trial. So if the trial was, "What is this?" the student said, "Oh, it's a mango." The teacher would say, "Yeah, correct. And this is a pineapple. And this is a pine cone." Okay? Then there was one condition that had an instructive feedback stimulus in both the antecedent and the consequent portions of a trial. And then there was a control condition which consisted of simply targets for which there was no instruction. Results were pretty similar for both of the participants. These are data for one of them. You don't have to look at this in detail, but basically the upper graph shows that the participant acquired the primary targets at about the same rate in all conditions, and the lower panel shows that the participant also acquired all of the secondary targets in those conditions, the ones that included secondary targets. So including secondary targets basically did not interfere with acquisition of the primary target. That's clear. Both participants acquired most of the secondary targets during instruction of the primary target or in probe sessions that followed mastery of the primary targets. And there really was no systematic difference between conditions, so it didn't matter if they included one instructive feedback stimulus or two, or where those stimuli were located within the trial. In this graph, you show how much time was spent on instruction per each target that was acquired in each condition. So what they did here was they looked at the total amount of instruction, the total duration of instruction in each condition, and also both instruction and probing that happened in each condition. And they divided that time by the number of targets that were actually acquired, which was obviously greater when when instructive feedback was included, when there were secondary targets. And so the leftmost bar shows the condition that included only primary targets. The other three bars show the three conditions, the three instructive feedback conditions. And you see that in general, when instructive feedback is included, because the participants acquire a lot more targets, there's less time spent on each target that is acquired. So basically, by incorporating secondary targets into instructional trials, this study suggests or supports previous studies suggesting that more can be taught in less time. It doesn't have to be, even though it's usually referred to as instructive feedback, it doesn't have to be in the form of feedback. It doesn't have to happen in the consequence portion of the trial. It can happen in the antecedent portion as well. And it seems to be fine to include information on two secondary targets in the same trials. Again, consistent with many other studies on instructive feedback that exist. As for the other studies, Tullis and colleagues used instructive feedback in the consequence portion of trials to teach problem explanations to children with autism. The primary target was selecting a picture card depicting a problem from an array of cards. So basically the participants were told, show me a problem. And they were shown picture cards that depicted like different scenarios, and they were supposed to pick up the one that showed a problem, like somebody was missing an item needed to complete a task. Okay, the secondary target was explaining why the scenario depicted in the picture was a problem. It was probed every two treatment sessions under extinction and trained if it was not acquired with instructive feedback alone. One of the participants acquired all of the secondary targets, and the other two required some direct training on the first set of secondary targets, but not on the others. Leaf and colleagues implemented instructive feedback during group instruction with 9 participants. The targeted tasks of comic book characters and professional basketball players as primary targets. The secondary targets were information on the team that each player played with or the superhero's powers. So if the primary target was Dwight Howard, the secondary target might be plays with the Rockets. They conducted instruction in groups of 3 children, delivered trials to one child at a time while the others observed, and participants generally acquired both primary and secondary targets that were directed to them, as well as observational primary and secondary targets that were being taught to other members of their group. Now, note that these were pretty high-functioning participants. Hawk asked the important question of what actually explains the acquisition of the secondary target when instructive feedback is used. And they wanted to know specifically, is the acquisition of the secondary target related to the behavior of the participant while the instructive feedback is being presented? So, for example, does it matter if the participant echoes some portion of the instructive feedback or otherwise demonstrates observation of the stimulus? So for one participant in their study, tact were both the primary and the secondary targets, and they found some preliminary evidence that attending to the visual stimulus while instructive feedback was delivered was related to acquisition of a secondary target. So maybe not surprisingly, I mean, if you're not looking at the stimulus, then how could you possibly acquire the tact? For the other participants, intraverbals were primary and secondary targets. And for that participant, they looked at the effects of echoing the instructive feedback stimulus, but found no effect that was related to acquisition of the target, at least not overt echoing. And so future research might take a closer look at prerequisites from benefiting from instructive feedback. Final study in this category used instructive feedback to increase the variability of intraverbal listing responses, similar to a previous study that used lag schedules to do the same thing. Instructive feedback consisted of modeling additional responses after a correct response. So if a child was asked, tell me 3 colors, and they said yellow, red, blue, the therapist would say, yeah, and pink, orange, and green are colors too. And both participants, novel response combinations and novel responses increased as a result of instructive feedback. This effect for one participant was limited to previously untaught categories, whereas with already known categories, she persisted in just saying, making the same response over and over again. And for the other participant, it was actually limited to only the previously mastered categories. All right, so don't have much time left. I'm going to tell you just a tiny little bit about a few studies on teaching conversation skills, and then a few studies on the PEAK curriculum. Conversation obviously involves complex verbal interchanges between speaker and listener. All of the verbal operands are involved here, and we sometimes see individuals with autism spectrum disorder diagnoses present with difficulties in this area, even when they have fluent repertoires, because, for example, they may have difficulty initiating conversation, difficulty responding appropriately to initiations, or they may not necessarily be sensitive to the interests of their conversation partners. I found 4 studies on teaching conversation skills, and I'm going to highlight a study by Peters and Thompson that came out in JABA. For an introduction, there are some individuals with autism who are easily engaged in conversation, but they tend to perseverate on conversation topics that don't necessarily interest their listeners. Anybody familiar with any examples of this? Yeah. So for example, you might have a child who's very interested in vacuum cleaners and really, really likes to talk about vacuum cleaners, but most potential conversation partners are just not going to be very interested in that topic. So the goal of this study was to teach children to respond appropriately to the interest of their conversation partner in the conversation. Participants were 10 children, 5 to 9 years old, and the first step of the intervention included teaching the participants to tact the behavior of their conversation partner as either interested or uninterested, just based on their facial expressions, body posture, and so on. Participants in experiment 1 were then taught to respond to an uninterested listener by asking the listener a question, and behavioral skills training was used to teach that. And participants in experiment 2 were taught to respond by asking a question, and they were additionally taught to respond by changing the conversation topic. So they were taught 2 different responses to an uninterested listener. And in conversation probes, the experimenter first initiated with an open-ended question like, what have you been up to? The experimenter then engaged as an interested or behaved as an interested listener for the most part during the probe, except in response to certain participant behaviors, the experimenter would turn into a disinterested listener. Okay, so for example, if the participant spoke for a long time without letting the experimenter speak, the experimenter would pretend to lose interest in the conversation. Same thing if they provided excessive detail, reintroduced a topic that had already been exhausted within the conversation. There were a few other examples as well. And then if the participant responded appropriately to this interest by changing the topic or asking a question, the experimenter did begin to behave as an interested listener again. And the probe ended after 5 opportunities to respond to an uninterested listener. So these are the data from the conversation probes. In experiment 1, there were 4 participants, and we see that in baseline, there's not a whole lot of, so this is the frequency of asking questions on the y-axis. We see in the first baseline phase, there is that behavior does not happen very much in response to experimenter disinterest. We also see that just being taught to tact the interest or the disinterest of the experimenter in the next phase does not by itself change the behavior. It's not until the kids are directly taught to respond to disinterest by asking a question that this behavior increases. And we see that they all acquired this response successfully. In experiment 2, the participants, so did the participants in experiment 2. Here we have two types of responses. The dark bars, or the dark color represents asking a question. The gray bars represent changing the topic, and we see that the participants are generally using both strategies after training. So again, learning to tact the listener's interest was not sufficient to alter participant behavior, but they all learned to respond to disinterest when that was directly taught. And there was also an experiment 3 where 4 participants from experiment 2 were successfully taught to switch to the alternative strategy of asking a question or changing the topic if the first strategy did not successfully re-engage the listener. So similar to the studies where participants were taught to alternate different command forms if the first one did not produce reinforcement. A nice touch was also that they had blind raters who watched pre- and post-training videos from conversation probes, and they found differences in the quality of conversation. Basically, the quality of conversation was rated as having improved post-training compared to pre-training. As for other studies, I'm going to skip really over this. This is a study from my own lab where we used lab reinforcement contingencies in order to shift conversation topics away from perseverating on circumscribed interests. In another study, kids were taught to initiate conversation by describing their feelings about an activity or an event. In a third study, children were taught to ask questions of visitors that they didn't know and then report information back to a third person. The final category of studies and the largest category of studies was on the PEAK curriculum developed by Mark Dixon and colleagues. PEAK stands for Promoting the Emergence of Advanced Knowledge, described on their website as an evaluation and curriculum guide for teaching basic and advanced language skills from a contemporary behavior analytic approach. Contains 4 modules: direct training, generalization, equivalence, and transformation. A large number of studies that came out in the last 2 years, 14 studies total that I was able to find. The one that I chose to highlight, but I don't think I will have time to talk about in detail, just appeared recently in JABA. Participants in this study were taught to match visual stimuli that belong to the same category, then respond as listener to a verbal label for that category by selecting a category member. This was taught with only one member of each category. So, for example, one color, one math symbol, one musical note. Categorization probes assessed listener responses to category labels with all the stimuli, including the ones that had not been included in listener training. And then they also had intraverbal probes that assessed emergent responses to questions about category members. And so this protocol represented one of the curriculum programs in the equivalence module of the PEAK system, if I understand correctly. So basically, without going into detail, 2 of 3 participants all of the participants successfully acquired the target responses. 2 of 3 participants showed emergence of intraverbal relations as well as categorization of stimuli that had not been directly taught. In another study, they they divided 27 participants randomly into 2 groups. One group received instruction on 5 programs from PEAK, from the direct training module, which is the first module in the program, while the control group received standard special education. They did find that the treatment group showed significant gains on the PEAK direct training assessment, whereas the control group did not. However, they didn't assess the effects of any other measures other than just basically the acquisition of the skills that were being taught. And then there were 8 additional studies evaluating other peak programs, generally produced positive results in the sense that the participants acquired the target responses. And 4 additional studies either obtained normative data or evaluated the psychometric properties of the peak system. And I think I have 3 minutes left. So do we have any questions at this point? Well, I hope you at least became aware of some of the stuff that's been going on in the literature. I see that 70 studies is a lot to cover, so maybe I'll try to cut this down a little bit before the afternoon, before I repeat the session in the afternoon. But I hope at least this was somewhat useful to you. And again, thank you very much for listening.
Let's thank Dr. Petersdottir again for her informative presentation. Remember that anyone seeking social work CEUs must sign in and out daily at the registration desk. Please complete an evaluation for this session through the Groupio app. The session number is 69, and the speaker was Dr. Petersdottir. The code is UPP685. UPP685. Does anyone need that repeated? All right, enjoy lunch.